Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name's David Crowe. I'm a member of the board of the National Press Club as well as the Chief Political Correspondent at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And today we're very lucky to have our guest speaker, Andy Penn, the Chief Executive of Telstra. Andy, as well as being CEO at Telstra, is also a member of an advisory committee to the federal government on cybersecurity, a key group of 10 individuals who advise the government on cybersecurity, and that will be one of the subjects of his speech today. It's great to have him here because Telstra was a foundation sponsor, or the foundation sponsor of the National Press Club 30 years ago. They've been a friend of the club for many, many years. They're also providing the communications link that makes today possible because due to the coronavirus, this is an online forum today. Andy cannot be in Canberra today to give the usual address in the usual way. He'll be speaking to us from Melbourne, from multiple screens around the room here. And so it's great to be able to make that possible in what is a first for the Press Club, unfortunately made necessary by the pandemic. Now, a little bit about Andy. He's been the CEO of Telstra for several years. Prior to that, he ran the insurance company AXA in this country and also worked for the company in Asia. He left school when he was 15 and then went back to study to become an accountant, then got an MBA and then joined the business world, and it was all the way up from there. So an interesting story, interesting views on some big issues facing Australia. And now I'll hand over to you, Andy, so all yours.
Well, thank you very much, David, and I am really sorry that I cannot be with you there personally today, but I am grateful to have the opportunity to join you virtually. Thank you also to Maurice, and thank you for being there, everybody in the room in person, even though I'm not. Can I also acknowledge my colleagues on the committee, as you alluded to there, David, Deputy Chair Cathy Reid, Rachel Falk, who's with you today, Corrine Best, Stephen Smith, Patrick Wright, Bevan Slattery, David Tudhope, as well as Chris Deeble, who I think is also with you, and Darren Kane. Chris and Darren were with me on the panel that advised the government in relation to the development of the strategy. And the one thing that I know is that all of the committee members are incredibly busy people. So I'm very grateful to them, and I know the government is grateful to them for this substantial amount of time that they have given to this work and their expert advice and counsel. Now, as many of you probably know, on May the 7th this year, a cyber attack shut down the largest petroleum pipeline in the United States. The Colonial Pipeline, which runs from Texas to New York, transports around 45% of the petrol, diesel and aviation fuel for the US East Coast. The attack, which was a ransomware attack, led to fuel shortages and the disruptions for tens of millions of Americans. And I guess the obvious question is, how did this happen? How sophisticated must this attack have been to shut down such a critical piece of infrastructure in the world's largest economy and one of the most technologically advanced nations? And the answer is, it actually wasn't that sophisticated at all. The root cause was a single compromised computer password. Ultimately, the hackers gained entry into Colonial's networks through a virtual private network account, a VPN. The VPN is what the company's employees were using for remote access, which is happening, of course, a lot these days with so many people working from home. The VPN account in question did not have multi-factor authentication, which is a pretty basic cybersecurity control. And this allowed the hackers to access Colonial's network simply by typing in the username and the password. Now, it's believed that they found the password in a stolen dump of data on the dark web. Ransomware has been the fastest growing form of malicious cyber activity over the last 12 months. At Telstra, we have assisted 17 enterprise customers over the last 12 months alone to recover from ransomware attacks, and this is just one form of malicious cyber activity. Because more abundant and better resourced cyber criminals, cyber activists, and increasingly emboldened nation-state actors mean that Australia and Australians are quite literally under constant cyber attack. Meeting this challenge means that our cyber defences have to be strong. They have to be strong, adaptive, and built around a framework that is coordinated, integrated, and highly capable. And that is what the 2020 Australian cybersecurity strategy is focused on achieving. And at a time when Australia aspires to be a world-leading digital economy by 2030, it is a mission that has never been more important. In its development of the strategy, it was shaped by the advice and guidance from an industry advisory panel, which was formed in November of 2019, which I was privileged to chair. In July of last year, we published our final report with some 60 recommendations, the overwhelming majority of which were adopted by the government. The government launched the strategy last year in August, and I'm grateful to Minister Dutton and subsequently Minister Andrews for the opportunity to also chair the Industry Advisory Committee, which is assisting in relation and advising in relation to its implementation. Today, the committee is releasing its first annual report, nearly 12 months since the launch of the strategy, and it is content from this report that forms the foundation of my remarks today. In that regard, therefore, I'm going to cover three things. Firstly, I will provide an update on the current cyber threat landscape. Secondly, I will outline progress on the implementation of some of the key initiatives in the strategy, including the committee's ongoing role in the shaping of these. And thirdly, I will provide a view of where we should be focused next and why. Malicious and dangerous cyber activity in Australia is happening all the time. In my opening remarks, I referred to ransomware as the fastest growing form of malicious cyber activity. Most ransomware attacks involve malicious software being introduced into a victim's systems environment, which encrypts target files, rendering them unusable until a ransom is paid. Unless the business has current offline backups, which can be restored quickly, and candidly, many don't, the business's operations are seriously compromised, and worse, the business may not be able to trade at all. Ransomware gangs are also now using a double extortion technique, where a copy of the data is stolen or exfiltrated before it is encrypted. So even if the victim can restore their systems environment, they have the double jeopardy of crucial and sensitive data being published onto the dark web if the ransom is not paid. There has also been a notable increase in the number of ransomware attacks using cryptocurrency as the medium by which ransom is paid. I'm going to come back to cryptocurrency later, but it is particularly attractive to criminals. As we saw in the Colonial Pipeline example, ransomware attacks have also become increasingly targeted towards entities perceived by criminals as high profile, high value, or that provide critical services. It's no surprise, therefore, that one of the first priorities of the cybersecurity strategy has been critical infrastructure. Having said that, this growing focus on high-profile targets does not mean small-scale targets are any safer, and unfortunately, many criminal gang groups are still very actively targeting unsecured individuals and small to medium-sized businesses. Yet another more concerning recent development is what we know as cybercrime as a service. Now, this is where criminals can now buy and use bespoke platforms if they do not have the technology skills themselves to commit a ransomware or other type of cyber attack. More sophisticated offenders can also, even these days, join an affiliate program that lease ransomware in return for a share of the ransom. This cybercrime as a service world includes help desks, service level agreements, and there's even a version of a regulator to oversee the number of ransomware attacks being conducted and where. Cybercrime as a service is particularly pernicious because where previously only a select few had the technical capability to launch disruptive attacks, the threat environment has now grown to include anyone that can access the dark web. Moreover, it makes the job of enforcement agencies much harder because historically attackers would be likely to leave their own pattern of behaviour, which could then be used to track down the source of malicious activity. Cybercrime as a service is cheap, it's relatively simple, and it can be devastatingly effective. Another rapidly growing area of cyber risk is business email compromise, known as BEC. This is particularly an issue for small, medium-sized businesses. This type of attack usually involves a criminal hacking into a person's email account and searching for opportunities to defraud the victim. For example, using a man-in-the-middle attack where they essentially access your inbox at work, seamlessly replicate a bill or an invoice that you may have received from a supplier, advise that the payment account details have changed so that the funds get sent to them instead of the proper supplier. Analysis suggests that at least $150 million was lost to this type of activity by Australian businesses in the 2019-2020 financial year. And indeed, since January 2020, over 2,100 incidents of BEC in Australia have been reported, and of those, more than half resulted in financial loss. This type of attack can, of course, also be directed to your personal email account too. And again, cyber criminals are becoming increasingly sophisticated in who they are targeting. I am personally aware of several very senior individuals who are customers of Telstra that have been very specifically targeted. And once the attack starts, it becomes very persistent. Another area of concern is supply chains. Criminals are not blind to the fact that pulling on one thread in the web of a supply chain can have a cascading effect. In Australia, logistics company Toll was impacted by the Mail 2 ransomware attack that took many of its core systems offline, forcing the company to resort to manual processes and causing significant delivery delays for its partners and its customers. Not long after the company managed to get back on its feet, a second ransomware attack happened. Once again, Toll was forced to resort to manual processing while it raced to get its systems back online. But this time, the attackers also stole 200 gigabytes of data and started publishing parts of that on the dark web in what I described earlier as this double extortion approach. Toll didn't pay the ransom, but its operations and customers were obviously severely affected. All supply chains are important, but perhaps none more so currently than the COVID vaccine supply chain, which stretches around the world. Telstra has been working with the government to monitor Australia's vaccine supply chains for threats, a critical precaution given the criticality of our vaccine program. In summary, therefore, the threat landscape is continuing to evolve and worsen, and Australia faces a complex and layered cybercrime environment that targets everyone from the local fish and chip shop to the ASX 200 company, from the local primary school to the global COVID vaccine supply chain. An environment where malicious, determined and sophisticated actors are employing a wide range of capabilities to target our networks to extort money or access sensitive information. Our citizens are at risk. They're at risk from identity theft, they're at risk from fraud, they're at risk from their rights to digital privacy. Cyber incidents were estimated to cost the Australian economy up to $3.5 billion last year. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre receives a cybercrime report every 10 minutes. 62% of small businesses report having experienced a cybersecurity incident. And globally, the World Economic Forum predicts that cybercrime could cost the global economy $6 trillion in 2021. And of course, as you heard from the Prime Minister last year, we are seeing a significant increase in nation-state sponsored malicious attacks targeting Australia. And whilst defending ourselves against such attacks is primarily a responsibility of government, industry too has a role to play through strategic partnerships. Cybersecurity is not just important for our economy, it is crucial for our national security. Given this background, the Australian government deserves real credit for the leadership it has shown through the development of Australia's 2020 cybersecurity strategy and its accompanying $1.67 billion investment commitment to help protect Australians from cyber threats. Since its launch last year, the strategy has established a solid framework and progress has been made in a number of key areas. Firstly, a comprehensive governance and evaluation approach and framework to oversee the implementation of the strategy has been established. This includes an interdepartmental committee on cybersecurity, the Cybersecurity Strategy Delivery Board, and the Industry Advisory Committee, which I chair. Secondly, the 2020 Security Legislation Amendment Act was introduced to Parliament last year with a focus on lifting the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure and systems of national significance. This includes increased obligations on operators of critical infrastructure to lift their cyber defences and mechanisms to facilitate government assistance in times of attack where national security is threatened. The bill is currently before the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and simultaneously a staged sector-by-sector approach on co-design of regulatory requirements is being undertaken to minimise regulatory burden and avoid duplication with existing legislation, for example, the Telecommunications Sector Security Reform Act. These changes will see minimum cybersecurity standards applied to operators of Australia's most important assets. And for most mature organisations, these baselines should not be anything new, with cyber already a key pillar of most risk and security programs. However, the reforms will seek to ensure that all relevant sectors have the appropriate programs in place. The measures are important because they're an important acknowledgement that we live in an interconnected world. If a cyber attack takes down the electricity grid, it impacts telecommunications, it impacts finance and banking, it stops trains, it stops traffic lights, and logistics comes to a halt. The third area that has been a particular focus this year has been in bolstering law enforcement capabilities. Fighting cybercrime depends on improving the capabilities of our national agencies. The Australian Federal Police and State Police are building a consolidated national framework to bring together the powers, capabilities, experience and intelligence from all of Australia's jurisdictions. The government has also announced a $90 million investment to expand the AFP's multidisciplinary cybercrime investigative teams across Australia. These teams comprise investigators, intelligence analysts and technical specialists. The Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre are also receiving increased investments to lift capabilities and resources. The ACSC has integrated law enforcement agencies, including the AFP and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, to enhance Australia's response to cyber threats. And through cooperation with other partners, the ASD has undertaken a number of offensive cyber activities, including disrupting cyber criminals selling credit card details on the dark web. And the ASD also assisted in the removal of over 6,000 websites hosting criminal activity and disabled infrastructure of offshore criminals responsible for stealing money from Australians during the COVID-19 pandemic. The government has also introduced the Surveillance Legislation Amendment Bill into Parliament to improve powers to discover, target, investigate and ultimately disrupt cybercrime, including on the dark web. More support is also being provided to victims of cybercrime. Additional funding has been provided to ID Care, an organisation which provides support to victims of identity theft, scams and cybercrimes generally. The fourth area that's been a focus over the last 12 months has been supporting the growth of Australia's cybersecurity skills. In February, the first round of grants under the Cyber Skills Partnership Innovation Fund, totalling $8 million, was announced. And in May, the Prime Minister announced a further $44 million expansion of this fund, creating opportunities for industry and education to work together on innovative programs to address skills and shortages in the cyber area. The Australian Defence Force and the ACSC have also progressed a number of initiatives to build cybersecurity skills and resources. And more support is also being provided to small and medium businesses, including an initiative to equip organisations such as chambers of commerce and business associations to address security skill needs in their areas. The fifth area that has been important this year in the rolling out of initiatives under the strategy is in relation to the role of the ACSC's joint cybersecurity centres. As part of the strategy, the ACSC has undertaken a range of initiatives to improve and further mature the JCSCs. These were identified during the strategy development as a key resource with which to further improve collaboration and cooperation between government, both state and federal, as well as industry. And this has included the expansion of the JCSC's workforce, including Home Affairs outreach officers, upgrading ICT and facilities to enable classified briefings, and expanding the tiering of the ACSC's partnership program with a particular focus on small and medium business, as well as the further development of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Sharing Platform, which I'll come back to later. The final area I wanted to comment on is raising awareness. It is important that we all understand the risks we face in a cyber world. We have never been more digitally connected, and this brings enormous benefits and opportunities, but it also means our privacy, identity, and our finances are at risk. While Australians and Australian businesses are improving their cyber resilience, many remain highly vulnerable to cybercrime. You don't need to invest in every security platform on the market, but you do need solid security foundations, such as those articulated in the government's Essential 8 framework. The Essential 8 provides a practical, easy-to-understand framework organisations can adapt to protect the systems that they care most about from cyber criminals. While it would be helpful for everybody to be familiar with the Essential 8, realistically, most small, medium businesses are unlikely to be so. In December, therefore, the ACSC commenced its campaign, Act Now, Stay Secure, with a focus on simple messages to the general population and small, medium businesses on how to prevent and recover from ransomware. If you get the basics of security right, you can become harder to target, and eventually the attackers will shift their attention elsewhere. Breaking open a locked door takes a lot of effort. Climbing in through an open window does not. In summary, therefore, there has been considerable progress with the strategy since it was launched just under a year ago. And there has needed to be, as the environment continues to evolve and malicious actors are becoming more sophisticated, more targeted, and more brazen. So I'd like to conclude my comments today with some thoughts about what's coming next. Where should our priorities be over the coming 12 months with the implementation of the strategy? The committee has identified several priority areas where it believes additional focus is needed, and I want to touch on these now. Firstly, where I was just commenting, and that is the importance of awareness raising. Despite the significant efforts in this regard, sadly, most Australians and Australian businesses are still ill-prepared for a direct cyber attack on them. It's crucial, therefore, that the strategy continues to focus on the awareness effort, and government should consider investing more resources and funding, in addition to those already announced, in improving the level of knowledge citizens need to better protect themselves online. Secondly, I want to highlight the critical and ongoing role played by the Joint Cybersecurity Centres, or the JCSCs. The JCSCs combine business, research and government to fight cyber threats, improve practices and share information in a trusted environment. We need to continue to enhance their capabilities because of the critical role they play in our ability to share information quickly and at scale between industry and government. Threat sharing is the key to threat blocking, and threat blocking is the key to cleaner pipes. So I encourage the government to accelerate the programs and initiatives that will lead to a much closer collaboration and active threat sharing between and across industry, government, through the JCSCs. The third area of focus over the next 12 months really needs to be on workplace readiness. Over the last 18 months, many of us have had to embrace hybrid working, a world where work is something that now not a thing that you do, but a place that you go. And as we move into the future where hybrid and remote working becomes a more permanent feature of business, organisations need to ensure their cyber defences reflect the reality of a distributed workforce, a reality where people may be accessing workplace systems and networks over VPNs and outside of normal workplace security arrangements. In that fast-changing world, cybersecurity literacy and training should be built into standard work practices in the same way that workplace health and safety has now become a shared responsibility of all individuals within an organisation. Fourthly, ransomware. I described earlier how ransomware attacks are increasing in number, but also in sophistication, and businesses face complex decisions when they are a victim of a ransomware attack. Focusing on better preparing businesses against ransomware attacks, clear advice on the payment of ransoms, and consideration of the pros and cons of cyber insurance regimes are all important areas in this regard. Prevention is always better than cure, so passwords, patching, offline backups are all key. Fifthly, evaluation. Evaluating the overall maturity of Australia's cyber capabilities is a complex undertaking and something that is challenging to communicate in a clear and simple way to stakeholders. The government has established a framework for governance and valuation for the strategy. However, more effort needs to be invested in developing the set of metrics and measures that can be used to assess the effectiveness of the initiatives being implemented and our overall level of maturity. The bottom line is we need to be able to measure who's winning and where, the good guys or the bad guys. Sixthly, the best practice regulatory task force, and you will have seen the consultation document on this that was issued yesterday by the government. As this task force reviews consumer protection, privacy and governance arrangements to determine whether they need to be further clarified and uplifted to address cyber concerns across the economy, the committee strongly recommends that the government consults deeply and broadly with industry with a view to mitigating regulatory burden. The seventh area is to foster international dialogue around cybersecurity issues. It is critical that Australia continues to work closely with other international like-minded nations in improving our cyber defences. This has become increasingly important due to the concentration and vulnerabilities in key supply chains that underpin the digital world, such as rare metals, silicon chips, semiconductors, and telecommunications radio access technologies such as 5G. These supply chains and others are crucial to Australia's digital economy aspirations. Technical standards also play an important role. In many different sectors, the setting of global technical standards provide a consistent framework of agreed requirements, specifications, and principles to work from. Cyber criminals have no respect for borders or jurisdictions, so it's important that like-minded countries have the ability to work closely with industry bodies to determine priority areas for international standards development. So these are the priorities for the next 12 months. However, looking further out, it is also important that we start to bring into focus a couple of other areas that will become increasingly significant in the cyber landscape. Firstly, cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrencies are a form of currency that are only available in a digital format. They rely on cryptographic algorithms to record financial transactions through a distributed ledger system. Bitcoin is the one we all know and is obviously the best known example, but there are many others. Cryptocurrencies are emerging as an area of focus from two perspectives. Firstly, cryptocurrencies are increasingly being used in ransomware as a form of payment. And secondly, cryptocurrency transactions are typically less visible to law enforcement agencies and hence their growing popularity with cyber criminals. Other forms of crypto assets such as smart contracts using Ethereum, non-fungible tokens will also become increasingly important areas of focus. They offer significant opportunities and they are exciting developments, but it will be important to understand and prepare for the potential vulnerabilities that come with them for individuals and businesses and how they could be exploited by malicious cyber actors. And then secondly and lastly, we need to have an eye on the role of supercomputing, advanced algorithms and artificial intelligence. I believe this is one of the most significant threats in the longer term. The challenge is simple. Could more powerful computers, such as quantum computers, crack the encryption codes and keys that we currently use to protect sensitive data, including financial data the world over? The answer to this question could well be yes, and that is why we need to start giving this some careful consideration now. Quantum computers will deliver dramatic advances in computational power and will enable once unsolvable problems to be solved. They will provide great benefits economically, medically, and technologically. But we also need to fully understand the level of disruption they may be bringing and may be able to challenge the cryptographic algorithms that we currently use. Interestingly, some analysts have coined the term Q-Day to mark the date at which quantum computers will have the ability to compromise key systems. And they estimate that we have about 5 to 15 years to prepare for this. And we need to start thinking about that right now. So, to sum it all up, the world has entered an extraordinary new era of technology innovation and connectivity. As a technology optimist, I am convinced we will see some society's biggest challenges solved and some of its biggest opportunities realised. At the same time, the ongoing challenge of COVID is seeing more of us working and studying from home and an acceleration in the digital economy. While many of us see opportunities, so do those who want to do us harm. And this is leading to increased levels of malicious cyber activity, both state-based and criminal. Protecting ourselves, protecting our families, protecting our businesses, protecting our country depends on Australia's cyber defences being strong, adaptive and built around a framework that is coordinated, integrated and capable. The 2020 cybersecurity strategy has the opportunity to be all of these things and provides an enormous and never more important contribution to a safer, more prosperous Australia. The Industry Advisory Committee look forward to continuing to work with the Australian Government to build Australia's cyber defences and play a key role in bringing this important strategy to life. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Fascinating. We've got a lot of journalists here in the room to ask questions. We've also got several who've emailed questions in, and they're ready to go. In fact, sorry, I'll put it this way. I am ready to read their questions to you. It's one of those rare times where the person sitting up or standing up here can decide that people will not get a second question. But I will start with one just about how you see the landscape at the moment, because I remember a time when companies would not disclose when they were subject to a cyber attack. They were embarrassed when it happened, they didn't know what to say, and they thought that investors, customers, governments would mark them down for simply having the experience of the attack, so they didn't reveal it, and that way information was not shared and nobody learnt how to deal with the problem. Can I ask you, what do you think is the proportion now of companies that disclose, and in what way can we use that to measure the scale of the problem? And do you think that it's fair enough if companies come under legal obligation from governments to disclose, that there's some penalty in a way if they do not disclose?
No, thanks very much, David. And I know this is a really live discussion. I think in answer to your question about the first piece about, how many companies are sort of open and disclose, I mean, I think, naturally there is still a disinclination to be open and transparent about a cyber attack. I think, companies naturally feel embarrassed, feel it's going to impact their brand. But I also think there is a stream of contemporary thinking that recognises cyber is a real live issue, and in fact the companies that are transparent in dealing with it, recognising it, communicating with their customers, are actually building more trust with their customers. Because the one thing that I think we have to take into account is often what will happen is if an organisation is hacked and data is stolen, the issue with that data is usually data that belongs to that company's customers as opposed to necessarily itself. And it is those customers who are best able to understand the risks associated with that data being disclosed on the dark web. And so you need to communicate with those customers as quickly as possible. I also think the JCSCs play a crucial role here. The JCSCs have a partner program. Historically, that's been focused on the big end of town. And I'm very pleased to see that they've established a partner program which combines small and medium businesses. And you heard that stat I referenced earlier, that 62% of small and medium businesses had experienced some type of cyber activity. So I still think that we are probably too reticent, and I think that does need to change, and I think it will start to change, and I think the JCSCs can play a role. As regards to the legal obligations, I think it's an interesting discussion, and it's one I'm sure that's going to get teased out through this next consultation process that I mentioned earlier about best practice regulatory task force, including questions such as, is it illegal or not illegal to pay ransomware, and some of these, and should a ransomware attack be notified to the government? I think these are important questions. I mean, currently, for operators of critical infrastructure, there are already obligations to disclose to the government through things like TSSR and the SOCI Act, malicious activity, and that would absolutely capture ransomware. But I think these are all part of our growing and maturing experience in how we come to terms with the cyber world in which we live today.
Our next question is from Sarah Ison from the West Australian.
Sarah Ison, you mentioned that Telstra has been working with the government to monitor Australia's vaccine supply trains for threats as a critical precaution. Can you confirm if there's been any attempted attacks so far? How likely do you expect that to be? And if I might quickly shove in a real parochial one, being from WA, of course. You mentioned petroleum in that case in the US. In WA, we're a huge resource state, of course. Do you think WA is at particular risk of those really worrying attacks for that reason, particularly given how much iron ore is propping up a lot of the bottom line for Australia and its economy?
Well, it's a really interesting question, Sarah. I'll come back to the vaccine chain one in a second. But on the point about the Colonial Pipeline one, there's a little bit of discussion, and I mentioned earlier there's even a sort of a form of regulator in the cyber as a service dark web landscape at the moment, because the challenge for the criminal actor of attacking something that's really high profile is that the potential reward may be high, but also the level of attention they're going to get is going to be pretty high as well. And so on that particular case, that's received a lot of attention, as you can imagine, from US law enforcement agencies, even to the point of tracking down the cryptocurrency ransoms that were involved in that particular effort. And so there's a bit of sort of, if you like, narrative on the dark web at the moment about, guys, come on, can we tone it down a bit? Can we go after some slightly less profile targets so that we don't actually attract as much attention? And so I think that's going to be an interesting dilemma. But look, certainly resources are a crucial part of our ecosystem and an economy, and naturally they're going to be a target, as are many other sectors as well. And in a sense, that's why critical infrastructure legislation and lifting defences on critical infrastructure has been one of the first priorities under the cybersecurity strategy. On the vaccine chain, I won't disclose all of the sort of work that we've been doing, but I think probably one thing to say is that you don't necessarily know what the motivation of an attacker is, and we see a lot of malicious activity all of the time. And so if we look at a supply chain on, say, for vaccine, which may start obviously with the pharmaceutical company in the first place, and then also all the way through logistics and other parts of the supply chain, there's malicious activity around all of those organisations all of the time, whether it's specifically targeted at the vaccine supply chain itself, or whether it just happens to be malicious activity targeted at a particular operator, such as a toll or otherwise, which I've mentioned. You don't necessarily know that at the time. But we haven't obviously had a live issue, otherwise we'd have all heard about it in that regard that's affected the supply chain.
Do you think it's likely that we'll have an attack on the vaccine supply chain?
Well, I think it's likely that there will obviously continue to be malicious cyber activity, which may or may not affect companies in the supply chain. But I think we're very, very attuned to it as the government is, as a critical supply chain to protect.
Thanks. And the next question is from Marion Ray from AAP.
Marion Ray, AAP. Move that down. There's been a lot of talk recently, drums of war being sounded. My question is really an area that you haven't mentioned, including all the legal work that's being done with industry. Space hasn't been mentioned, and space is crucial for communications and surveillance. Optus has recently said it's concerned there's radio silence on space and the critical infrastructure legislation that's being developed. So I'm wanting to know how much of a concern that is for Telstra, and more generally, how involved will you be in the space program, the public space program that's now being developed?
Yeah, no, look, Marianne, space is obviously an important ingredient in all of this, particularly as one of the things that we're seeing is both the technological advancement of traditional geostationary high orbital satellites, but also we're seeing an increase in the volume and number of low orbital satellites that are being basically sent up there, providing communication coverage. And so they are going to play an increasing role in telecommunications. We do use satellite currently for various different aspects of our communication services. For example, we use satellite in what we call backhaul, which is basically a reference to how we take the data from the mobile tower back into the core network, as opposed from the mobile tower to the phone. So we use satellite in that. Obviously, NBN uses satellite to communicate and provide internet services. As you mentioned, Optus uses satellite as well. And we're all subject to TSSR, which is the Telecommunications Sector Security Reform Act, which does put obligations on us. So it is very much a function of it is captured under critical infrastructure by virtue of the technology that we use. And, I think it will continue to grow in importance and significance as it becomes a more prevalent form of technology which is used.
Thank you. Our next question is from Max Madison of The Australian.
Hello, Mr. Penn. Hello, everyone. Unlike many private and public institutions, hackers are innovative, adaptive, and don't adhere to any rules of engagement. Consequently, should we be resigned that the nation's cybersecurity defences are always going to be one step behind cyber criminals? And as a follow-up, as part of the cybersecurity strategy, do you foresee offence forming part of the nation's defence, using proactive strikes to damage the critical infrastructure of cyber criminals, whether they're state-sponsored actors or otherwise?
Yeah, look, thanks, Max. In relation to your first question, does it follow that we'll always be one step behind? No, I don't think it follows that we'll always be one step behind, but I do think that it follows that unless we continue to invest, there is a risk that, cyber criminals get ahead of us. And so the name of the game is, this isn't a stationary landscape. This isn't a game that's going to, it's going to be over at any point of time. We're seeing, different developments that I've mentioned, the growth in ransomware over recent times, the evolution or the sort of the appearance of ransomware as a service. I've talked about the role of cryptocurrency, supercomputing powers coming over the horizon, artificial intelligence. So, this landscape is continuing to evolve and to continue to increase in sophistication. And I think as we, as a world, do more and more things digitally, which is, providing great opportunities and improvements to efficiency and, social and health benefits and all sorts of other opportunities, so too goes with that the responsibility to continue to beef our cyber defences. As regards to the use of offensive cyber activity, I have mentioned in my comments and in the report, that's obviously very much a realm and a role for the government and government agencies to determine. But there's certainly, as we've reported, the increasing capability for our law enforcement agencies to be able to undertake exercises to effectively disrupt criminals offshore. And so, beyond that, really, that's a matter for the government to comment on.
Thank you.
Thanks. And because we're getting quite a few questions coming in by email from journos who are watching the YouTube broadcast, I'll go now to a question from Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review. This is on Telstra rather than cybersecurity, Andy. Andrew asks, we've seen reports that Digicel, the main mobile phone carrier in the Pacific, is on the market. There's concern within the Australian government about the company falling into Chinese ownership, with reports the Australian government may help finance rival private bidders. Has the government spoken to Telstra about bidding for Digicel? Is it a business you might be interested in, either as an operator or a joint venture partner, perhaps as a patriotic duty?
Well, look, I think that's really a question that you should direct at the government. I think given the comments that you've made behind the question, it wouldn't be for us appropriate to sort of comment on any conversations we may or may not have had with the government. Okay,
and I'll go to the next question, which is from Chris Duckett, the editor of ZDNet Australia. It's about insurance companies paying ransoms when we see cyber attacks. What's your view on that practice? Are they helping or are they actually hindering the rest of the industry when they pay up?
Well, my personal view, and in fact our policy as a company, is not to pay ransomware, or not to pay ransoms rather. And, I can certainly see in situations where businesses are attempted to do so. I mean, their whole business livelihood could be at threat from a ransomware attack. But candidly, it's hard to see how that is ever going to end well if you pay a ransom. Obviously, you're sending a signal to criminals that that's something that you'd be willing to do. Criminals talk amongst themselves on the dark web. You're just as likely to invite another ransomware attack. And there's no guarantee, you're dealing with criminals here, so there's no guarantee that you can trust the party who's the counterparty that you're engaging with. The best advice is actually to be well prepared to prevent a ransomware attack, and the sorts of things you can do there is making sure that you've got good password management, You've got offline backup. The first thing that a ransomware attacker will do is it will search your systems for your backup files. So you do not want them to be online. You need those to be offline so that you can recover your systems if that occurs from your backups. They're the sorts of things that you can do. Small businesses, patching software, crucially important as well. So there's prevention, frankly, is much better than trying to solve it after the event. But certainly our policy position would be not to pay ransoms.
Thanks. Our next question is from Lisa Vicentin from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
Thank you, Mr. Penn. Can I ask firstly how often, if ever, Telstra is experiencing cyber attacks? Are you constantly fending them off, given your policy not to pay ransoms? And then can I also just pivot off David's question earlier about legal responsibilities around disclosing attacks? Another question that has been proposed by the government this week is whether company directors such as yourself should be personally legally liable when their companies fail to take adequate measures to stop an attack. Can I pin you down on whether you believe they should?
Sure. Look, on the... sorry, what was the first part of your question?
Sorry, the first part of the question was whether Telstra has ever had an attack here.
Whether we see attack. Look, we monitor malicious activity on the network all of the time, and there is always malicious activity on the network. Let me put it that way. I mean, how targeted it is, how specific it is, varies, but there is... I mean, because Telstra is a telco, we are sort of in a relatively unique position. So not only do we see things that are perhaps targeted us directly, but we just see malicious activity generally, and that goes to the heart of threat sharing. But absolutely, Telstra is a target as much as any other organisation, and we have built strong defences to make sure that we mitigate any implications from that.
Are you seeing that from both state and cyber criminals?
All of the above. Okay. And then what I would also say, sorry, then on terms of directors' responsibilities, so there's a couple of pieces under the cybersecurity strategy. So the first priority under the cybersecurity strategy was in relation to operators of critical infrastructure, and therein the government is recognising that that critical infrastructure is crucial to the national economy and crucial to national security, and we already have obligations to ensure that we maintain certain levels of cybersecurity, and we're very open and transparent with the government regarding just the design of our networks and how we operate those networks and any malicious activity we see on our networks as well. And then there's a piece that came out, as you said, yesterday, which is actually beyond critical infrastructure, looking more broadly about what the responsibilities of organisations are that provide products and services which are digital to ensure that those meet appropriate levels of cyber defences, and also they maintain an appropriate degree of cyber protection within the environment. So positive security obligations is definitely a part of the critical infrastructure legislative process, and it's currently under consultation as to whether or not directors have responsibilities, or what. I don't actually think the question is whether directors do have responsibilities. It's probably more the extent of directors' responsibilities and the consequences in the event that they don't actually maintain a digital environment which is cyber safe and cyber secure. And I think therein lies, it sort of depends on the significance of the products and services. I use an example, if I'm a motor manufacturer and I'm increasingly introducing assisted driving technology into my vehicle, I must have some degree of responsibility to ensure that the programs and the software that we're introducing that provides that assisting driving has some degree of cybersecurity associated with it. And so I think these things are a question of degree, but I do think it is likely that we will see increasing obligations on companies and directors to take the cyber risks further into account.
Thank you. Andy, I'm going to follow up on that because we also have a question from David Browery of Information Age on the same subject. And it really is, I just want to sort of follow up on this issue of a legal responsibility where directors are personally liable for cybersecurity breaches or for not disclosing them or for making ransom payments. Do you think in the range of options for directors that personal legal liability should actually go that far to get them personally?
Look, I think in certain circumstances, yes, ultimately there has to be some degree of legal liability. As a director, you have a fiduciary responsibility to act and conduct your role to the appropriate degree of, standard, and not to be negligent. But I don't think we want to be using just a stick to try and change the landscape. I think there's obviously a lot more things that we need to do beyond that. But ultimately, in egregious situations where the exposure to cyber risk, is seriously, potentially a threat to national security, or it's a threat to, health or safety or otherwise, and there has been complete sort of negligence towards ensuring that there are some basic cyber defences in place, then I think directors obviously have to be responsible, as they are in other situations, whether it's in health and safety or in doing business responsibly and acting in a fair and non-misleading way.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Nick Stewart.
Thanks for a strong speech. You've made the point that business has a responsibility. Also, our last digital report card didn't show that the government was actually doing the right thing all the time in particular departments. Should secretary of departments be held responsible? Should, for example, there be absolutely no suggestion of any bonuses to an entire department if the department doesn't pass the cybersecurity hoop?
Oh, look, I won't comment on bonuses within government. It's bad enough talking about bonuses in the private sector. But look, what I would say is, I think to your point more seriously, is that an important plank of the cybersecurity strategy was the hardening of government's own systems as well. And I think, the government recognises that they need to lead by example. And, I think in lots of areas, the government is pressing ahead. Services Australia have been doing some great work in terms of digitising Services Australia, particularly became important under Minister Stuart Robert, particularly important during the period of, all of the various different COVID-related support packages for our citizens in this country, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, etc. So hardening government systems is absolutely a key platform and a key part of the strategy as well. But I won't comment on remuneration within government.
Could the departments just be named and shamed?
Well, I think a bit as my sort of response to directors is that, ideally, I think the best way forward is we can incent and encourage and help educate to improve our overall cyber defences, but rather than using a stick all the time. But, ultimately, I think that, we do need a bit more transparency. That's one of the points I mentioned in my speech around metrics and measures to determine, so we know whether the initiatives that we're putting in place under the cybersecurity strategy are making a difference. And I think that transparency will be helpful. And so I think we have some way to go on that, not just in government, but I think just more generically, but including government.
Thanks. Our next question is from Tim Shaw, who's a director of the National Press Club. Can't make it here today, but has sent in a question, I think from Sydney. He says, Telstra's recently agreed to sell a 49% interest in its mobile towers to the Future Fund, with half the $2.8 billion proceeds being returned to shareholders. This on top of the $11 billion sale for the copper network that is used by the NBN under that long-term agreement. Tim asks, are there any further asset sales being considered, and if so, why? Or is there nothing left on the Telstra farm to sell?
Let me answer this way. Telstra used to be owned by the government. It was a government enterprise. The government privatised Telstra about 20 years ago, for which it received more than $50 billion, probably on a time value-weighted average of money, a lot more than it spent on the NBN. So Telstra shareholders paid the government a very large amount of money for Telstra. The government decided to renationalise part of Telstra through the creation of the NBN and paid them compensation for $11 billion to do that. By the way, the $11 billion is less than Telstra shareholders paid for that part of the network when they bought it from the government in the first place, but let's park that to one side. The towers deal really is part of a strategy that we currently have to recognise the long-term value of telecommunications infrastructure and to find new sources and new ways to raise capital so that we can continue to invest in building out the sort of infrastructure and the network that we need to support regional and rural Australia. Australia is a very large country, and so providing coverage and communications to all of regional and rural Australia is a very expensive exercise. And as a publicly limited company, because we are now a publicly limited company, and because most of our shareholders are actually the superannuation funds that look after your superannuation and your retirement savings, we have an obligation to obviously generate attractive and appropriate returns for that. And so working with the government on co-investment arrangements such as mobile black spots programs or regional connectivity plans is a really good way of recognising that, so we get a good policy outcome overall. It enables us to be able to afford, and other operators to be able to afford, to invest technologically where we might not otherwise be able to because it's just commercially not viable, and also to increase coverage. And so that deal with the towers company is just one more method in terms of how we do that. In terms of other assets of infrastructure, that's probably for another day.
A follow-up on that, because I know that there are elected members of Parliament who are unhappy with aspects of this agreement. They want more money being spent on the quality of service from these mobile phone towers so the customers benefit. How much of the $2.8 billion is actually going to improving the services for Australian communities?
Well, as I say, Telstra invests more than anybody in regional and rural Australia. We've spent about $5 billion literally over the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, I announced a further $500 million in recent weeks investing in regional and rural Australia. Those members of Parliament, I think, are confusing their own government policy and their own obligations with Telstra. We're a private enterprise. We're there to work with and to help and support investment, and we are investing very significantly. We invested overwhelmingly in the mobile black spots program, more than the rest of the industry put together. We were the only major operator to support the regional connectivity program. It is unfortunately a fact that not every part of Australia will receive mobile coverage. Australia has a landmass of about 7.8 million square kilometres. Telstra covers about 2.5 million square kilometres, which is more than 1 million greater than our next nearest competitor. But the bottom line is we're not going to be able to cover every square inch of Australia. That is a reality, and unfortunately those members of Parliament need to come to terms with that reality. The other point I should say as well is that in certain electorates we actually have plans in place to put towers in, but unfortunately those members have not been able to actually get their own local councils to approve the planning permits to get the job done. So I do, and I have said this previously with a couple of these individuals, that they need to go and have a walk down the corridor of Parliament House and talk to their colleagues, not to Telstra.
Are you suggesting some Liberal MPs don't understand how the free market works?
Either that or they choose not to, because it's politically helpful for them to say the comments that they say.
I'll move on to the next question. This has also come in by email. It's from Rowan Pearce, who's the executive editor of Comms Day. And Rowan asks, Andy, just in regards to the critical infrastructure legislation currently before Parliament, do you have any concerns about the proposed power allowing the government to directly intervene in a company's systems to counter a cyber attack?
No, I don't, but I do know it's an area that's sensitive, and for the broader audience, the concept here is that one of the things that the critical infrastructure legislation is going to seek to achieve is to set the framework for when and how government can come in and assist an operator of critical infrastructure in a situation where that operator is under attack, where that attack and that infrastructure together is considered to be a risk to national security. And I sort of liken everything in the cyber world to the physical world. If we were a nation and one of our ports was under a physical attack from an international adversary, and there were jet fighters coming in or whatever other physical warfare was being deployed, I don't think we would think twice about the Australian Air Force being deployed to go and protect that infrastructure, regardless of whether that infrastructure was owned by the government or a private operator, for 1 minute. In a cyber attack, analogise the same situation, we obviously need a mechanism whereby the government and government agencies, which are skilled in, obviously, cyber defences and cyber warfare, to be able to work alongside operators of critical infrastructure to enable them to protect the national interest and protect national security. Of course, on the other side, in the side of the operator's sitting there saying, well, hang on a second, I'm worried about government coming in and pushing me aside and sitting in my seat and running my network infrastructure. What happens if they stuff it up, and what happens if I then become liable to lots of my customers because I'm not providing my service? They're legitimate concerns. And so that's what we need to work through to create a framework and an environment where government assistance can be effectively deployed where it's necessary to from a critical national security point of view, but critical infrastructure operators also can be protected in the process of allowing that to happen and work in partnership. Because the bottom line is, if I take my telecommunications network, for example, nobody knows better than us how to run the telecommunications network. But also, we're not necessarily experts in, international cyber activity from a defence and from a warfare perspective. And so clearly you need both parties at the table to be able to ensure that the country is protected in the interest of national security.
Thanks very much, Andy. There have been some other questions that have come in. We've run out of time. We've tried something new today due to the pandemic. I'm glad to say that it's worked. Thank you very much for being here with us. We've actually made Press Club history because this is the first time we've done an online YouTube address in this way. Thank you again. We have the gift that we give our speakers here in the room when they appear. It's the National Press Club membership, which is yours when you come down here. Morris Riley, the Chief Executive, tells me that there's also a very good quality bottle of wine for you when you eventually get down here to the National Press Club in Canberra. There are some things that email cannot deliver that just can't be done by the NBN. So we hope that we'll see you down here. Please, everybody, join me in thanking Andy Penn.